Hey guys, welcome to my studio. My name is Sarah Yeoman and I'll be painting you through an Adirondack landscape today. This is a place in the Adirondacks that I'm very fond of, where I kayak and I spend a lot of my summers up there teaching and painting. I do a quick sketch of the subject matter with a 4B pencil, working on a 30-degree angle. I'm going to start off doing almost like a wet and wet into the sky area. I'm going to be wetting the top of the page with two colors, lavender, which is from Holbein, and a yellow ochre, which is a Winsor Newton pigment. So using my large squirrel mop brush, which has a nice soft texture, it really helps the paint to flow across the page. Painting the pigments in separate areas really and trying to let them sort of mix on their own, and it will do this because the page is the paper is on an angle, and I just love what these two colors will do together. And it does look like it's a bit strong, I know, but remember, watercolor is going to dry about 30% lighter than how we put it on. So I know it's not going to be quite this strong when it dries, but it will create a beautiful background atmosphere for the rest of the painting to come. So I'm just laying a little more paint in some of the areas to strengthen some of the pigment and the suggestion of the shapes and the movement of the sky. Remember, skies are not always just horizontal, they're often on an angle. So it's a great way to give a little interest to a sky, not painting it, perfectly horizontal. Now I'm just kind of pulling the brush along that bottom area so that I make sure I have the whole sky area wet before I go to put in the distant trees, the mid trees, and the larger dark masses to come. So starting to mix a mixture of cobalt turquoise light and lavender, and using a number 14 brush round. I could have gone a little bit bigger with the brush on this because it takes a little more time working with a small brush to get these masses in. So these are the distant background forms, and they will end up resembling trees at some point. But right now I'm trying to just get those shapes in there without saying too much about trees. Often we will paint trees by making lots of vertical lines with lots of little pointy edges coming out of them, and it ends up looking a bit like a picket fence. So anyway, doing a little bit of line work, not a whole lot, just sort of responding to the shapes, and again, trying not to paint trees. I'm painting shapes and masses and values at this point, because you can see that the values I'm putting on are a deeper value than the original sky wash. And you can see it's starting to show up now. That mass that I've painted in those cool colors has a nice feeling of distance. So now I'm mixing a little bit of stronger pigment. This is yellow ochre, cerulean blue, and cobalt blue. Again, thinking in terms of large shapes, still not really painting trees. Thinking about creating the darker shapes that are on either side in this painting. A little bit of, again, line work, calligraphy, and again, just responding to the wet paper, allowing the paint to move a little bit. I know that it's not going to hold a hard edge at this point, which is what I want. I want this to say very atmospheric with soft edges. But as I do that, as you put in these darker pigments in this layer, you have to remember that this has to be a little bit heavier in terms of its paint to water ratio. So there's a little more paint in this mixture and a little less water. And remember, we're working on a wet area. It's already wet. There's already water there. So we don't want to put in pigment that has too much water in it. Again, using the tip of the brush to get a little bit of finer line. Still not holding a hard edge, but it's starting to hold a little bit of shape. And you can see we're starting to get that nice dark going in there. This is the same mixture, perylene green and ultramarine blue, just use a little heavier, and still thinking about shapes and masses and variety of brush strokes. And you can see the way I kind of lay the paint on the page. I try to change the mark making each time I touch the brush to the paper. Try not to repeat the same mark over and over again. And it's a challenge. It's my challenge sometimes with this is to not think too much and just respond. Just get those masses in there and remember that to suggest the tree forms, often it's just painting the mass and then letting the hint of the trees come from that mass. So still thinking of this darker value as one large shape. And being a little selective in where I'm putting the darks now. Trying not to put them too far into the background. Uh, Again, a little touch here and there, a little deeper suggestion of paint for the trunk. Doing a little bit smaller line work here and there. Really just trying to fill in some of those lighter shapes so that this looks like a dense woods or a dense forest. Still using the same pigments, perylene green and ultramarine blue. And we have to remember it's going to dry 30% lighter than how we put it on. So this may look like it's too dark, but it's actually going to end up hopefully right in the same value, the right value range. A little bit of splattering to get texture on there. I do love to throw paint. What does happen is sometimes the paint gets thrown in the wrong spot, but don't panic when you get these little spots on your paper because it's really easy enough to just make it go away. I'll just use a little bit of a paper towel and just sort of touch it on there. I'm not going to rub it with a brush. It will disappear really, and I'm just going to put some tree shapes over top. Often we want to just leave things alone and not try to fix them right away because often they won't matter when you get to the end of the painting. It really won't matter that something that might bother you now is not going to bother you at the end of the painting. Here I have a little bit of brown matter on my brush and I'm doing some of the almost calligraphy work, I call it. I'm suggesting some of these warmer tree shapes of the old skeletal trees. And I really, again, try not to think too much about the painting of trees. I'm doing just a little bit of back and forth line work. Don't want to say too much. I'm just going to hint at those forms. And the brown matter works really nicely playing against that sort of those blue-green background trees and the yellow ochre and lavender of the sky. And don't repeat it too many times. Just because it looks good once doesn't mean we want to run those tree shapes all the way across the paper. Again, a little more texture here and there, a little more shape making. I again don't plan these too much ahead of time. I really just respond to the pigments that I'm using and the weight of the paper, what colors are doing, and they react differently every time. Here I'm taking my little flat 3/4 inch brush and lifting back into that wet paint. And this is just such a great way to pull out trunks or branches or to lift an area that you feel has gotten a little dark or a little uninteresting. Um, so it's my favorite little flat brush. And see, I can lift up those little spots that might have been a problem. Though really, they're fading enough that you don't even really see them anymore. Make a larger suggestion of a tree trunk over here on the left. And I will fill that in or touch another color in there so that it doesn't stand out too much. But the flat brush is just a great way of you don't have to worry about saving all the light ahead of time. You can come back in with that flat brush because the paper is still damp and the paint is pretty thick. So it allows me to go back in and lift up that light. A few more darks in here with the same combination of the Perylene Green and Ultramarine Blue. I can push it to a really, really dark pigment. And this is almost the weight of toothpaste at this point, the pigment that I'm laying on. So it's pretty heavy, a little bit of water in it. But that's the only way it'll really hold into this wet paper. And when you work in this wet and wet method, you have to increase the weight of the pigment as the paper starts to dry to get your darks to hold. So a little more texture on there. And now I'm just taking my round brush and sort of softening those edges where a little bit of the paint and water has settled. I didn't want too much of that to drip into this mid-ground area. So this is my round brush going into the mid-ground with a combination of mostly yellow ochre and probably a little touch of cobalt blue. And you can see I'm working pretty dry in there. I'm just trying to get that pigment in there and up next to that damp edge of the background. And I love the way they're sort of fusing together. And I can use my brush to go back in and sort of mess up that edge or smush that edge a little bit so that they blend nicely together. And I can, again, suggest a little bit of texture on there and a little bit of light. Here's cobalt blue and the yellow ochre again, just a little bit more cobalt blue in the mixture, and just touching that back into the wet area of that mid-ground field, just to give the suggestion of a little bit of light change and shadow change. And then the same color on this form on the right hand side, which is kind of the bend in the riverbank. It's a little closer to us. I think of this as the mid-ground. So yellow ochre, and there's probably a little bit of cobalt blue in there again. Just getting the pigment on that shape, wetting the shape so that I can then drop other pigment into it. And using my brush to do a little bit of drawing and sort of trying to figure out what that shape is going to do. Again, when I draw, I don't have everything drawn very precisely. I just kind of respond to the paint and what it's doing, how it's moving down the page, and just watching for something wonderful to happen, which is what watercolor is really good at. And trying to paint intuitively and not overthink it too much. I kind of like the feel of that. I think I'll do maybe a little more lifting in here, just to let a little more light hit a few areas so it's not so solid back in there. Yeah, that's nice. Just the hint of something different going on. And do a little lifting in that mid-ground form with my 3/4 inch flat. And be careful not to get too carried away with it. It's easy to just keep going on this. The next area I'm going to be working on is this mid-ground rocks. And this is going to be a wet into dry, so wet paint on my brush into a dry surface, and this is a great way and a great color combination for rocks and trees, tree trunks. It's just cobalt blue and brown matter, and what I do is I'm sort of pulsing the two colors back and forth from mostly cobalt to mostly brown matter back to a mixture that leans a little warm and then a little cool, and just sort of pulsing that back and forth through the whole form, connecting the shapes, though I'm not just painting around the shape. I'm painting from one side of the shape all the way to the other side. And this is going to end up being the light on my rocks. And I know it doesn't look like it's light right now, but it will. It's going to dry a lot lighter. And then when I put this second wash on, you'll see how light this looks. Anyway, it's a great way to figure out rock shapes, difficult rock shapes, and really simplify the painting of them. Again, a little brown matter in there, a little cobalt blue, and as I come over to the far left side. Sometimes I add a little bit of the ultramarine blue to deepen that mixture, although that looks like it might just still be cobalt blue. There's a little bit of brown matter, and see what happens when the page is on an angle, how beautifully that paint sort of moves down the page. So I'm dropping the pigment into the already painted area, and you get these wonderful color combinations when you let the pigment kind of mix itself. We could never get those colors on our palette and then apply them to the page. And I'm going to lift up some of those areas at the bottom. They're starting to bead up a little bit. If I leave those like that, they're going to back up into the page. So in just a second, I'm going to pick some of those up. Still deepening the pigment in those areas a little bit, because to me it's a lot darker on the left-hand side of those rocks, and I don't want the center of interest to be all the way over there on the left. So lifting that little bit of pigment that's catching at the bottom, softening the bottom edge on that mid landform, so it feels like there's a little bit of light touching it before I go to put in the foreground water. I'm using my flat brush to go back in and lift that. The line was getting a little crooked because the pigment was moving down the page there, so I'm just changing that line and making it a little more horizontal. Again, the flat brush to lift up a little of those edges. So now I've dried this completely, and I'm going to come back into the rock shapes with the exact same color combination with a round brush. It's the cobalt blue and the brown matter, and it's a little bit heavier this time. The ratio of paint to water is a little different. So same pigment, but a deeper value of those pigments. And that's a great thing to practice, mixing two colors, but not just mixing them, but being able to change the value of those two colors. So you can see this is a deeper value, and as I put in these deeper values to suggest the shadow shapes on the rocks, then the light on the rocks is going to start to show up. And I started out with a round brush that I really wasn't comfortable with. It wasn't really flowing, the paint wasn't flowing enough. So in just a second I'm going to switch to a brush that is a little firmer, and some days it's like that. I use this brush all the time, and this time I just couldn't get it to respond the way I wanted to. So I'm going to switch over to a different brush in just a second. So again, the same color combination, brown matter and cobalt blue, shifted back and forth, sometimes mixed right to a neutral, but you really can see it's a little warm, it's a little cool, it's a little warm, it's a little cool. Excuse me. Just painting those shapes, and when you do the rock drawing, just make sure you know where those light shapes are, and if you have to use a pencil to remind yourself where they are, if you do that first wash, that might be a good idea, because you really want to just paint the shapes of the shadows. So I just switched to this new brush. It's a little firmer, and it allows me to get some better edges there. Same two colors, nothing has changed, just using them in a little heavier weight. And I love just kind of pulsing back and forth between two colors, seeing the different combinations. And that was a little pure red in there, so I'm dropping a little more cobalt blue in there so it didn't read quite so much like pure brown matter. It's a great color combination. I use it for trees a lot, and actually all kinds of things. They play very nicely together. So putting the shadow shape on the front of that rock that's sort of sticking out into the waterway a bit. And trying to find that shape exactly where I drew it. Again, so we can let the light that's hitting the top of those rocks show up. So the first wash is painting the light, and the second wash is figuring out how to not cover up all the light. That is so often a problem for my students. They get these beautiful first washes, and it's the second wash that really they find difficult to do. But I remind them that if you just paint the shapes, then the light is going to show up. So beautiful pigment there. I love the shift from the warm to the cool. And it's starting to show up. I know it's taken a little time to be able to see it. This is one of my favorite places to paddle up in the Adirondacks, and I always take my students back in here when I'm running a workshop. I put everybody in kayaks, and we paddle upstream a couple miles to this spot, and yeah, really one of my favorite places. And I've painted on location here, so yeah, very dear to me. So still using the same color, switching back and forth, and as I get to the left side, I'll probably add a little bit of ultramarine blue to the mixture here and there, just because it does allow you to create something that's a little bit darker. I often will use the brown matter with ultramarine blue if I want something to go into a much darker value range. So they all play very nicely together. Again, more cobalt blue in that mixture. Here's more brown matter. I can see I just dipped into that ultramarine blue. And that looks a little red, but you see I'm going to drop a little more pigment in there. But if you look back at what I've done, all I've done is paint shapes. And as I've painted those shapes, now the light on top of those shapes is suggesting the sunlight hitting those forms. And if you remember, we painted that first wash. It looked like it was kind of dark, and when you look at it now, you can see that it's really just a beautiful suggestion of light. So going in and just kind of throwing a little paint in this area just to close that up and quiet it down a little bit. It was a little too strong. Sometimes I just kind of keep putting paint on something until I can figure it out. I threw a little pigment back in there, a little yellow ochre back in there as well. Deepening these rock forms. Again, with the same colors that I've been using on them, and it's damp in there, so the pigment just still is flowing very nicely. Lifting up a little bit of that pigment that's pooled on the bottom. Yeah, that's looking good. Some nice depth in that midground now. I'm pretty pleased with it. And a few more darks here and there. You don't necessarily want to save all that light. Sometimes we have to lose a little bit of our beautiful light so that the light that does show is important. So I'll probably get rid of some of that light at some point and push it back a little bit. Again, it should be deeper over on that left side because we don't really want our eye to get stuck over there. Still working into that damp surface. And as soon as that starts to dry and it's not damp anymore, I won't try to put any more paint on it. That's when you get those blooms, when you're trying to introduce pigment to areas that are already starting to dry. So I threw a little paint back there on the left-hand side, and we can stop in just a second. I dry this with a hair dryer before I move on to the next stage. I'm going to move into the water area now, and I'm going to use the same technique that I used in the sky. I'm going to put a little bit of water on it to start, just to make sure it really looks fluid. I always suggest to students that they wonder how to paint water, and I and I say, well, start with water, wet the page. That will guarantee you a nice watery look. So I'm going to use the same colors that I used in my sky, which is yellow ochre. And I'll start with a nice broad wash of that. And when you're doing reflections in the water, it's the opposite angle of what it is in the sky because it's a reflection. So I'm angling it a different way than the sky yellow is angled. So here's the lavender. Strengthen that a little bit. There we go. There's a little stronger lavender. And trying to get the pigment everywhere in that water area because I did wet it ahead, so there's some nice movement in there. I love how these two colors sort of mix together. Yeah, they play very nicely together. Just strengthening that again, touching a little bit of yellow ochre back into the water, back into the purple, just a touch, and making sure that wash comes all the way down. There we go. And again, a little stronger lavender here and there. I want to make sure it's wet enough everywhere that when I go to put these next set of shapes in, that it's going to be fluid enough for the shapes to hold. So I'm going to put in the rock shadows first, or the rock reflections. And I'm going to use the same combination that I did for the rocks. It's the cobalt blue and the brown madder. And we have to remember we're working on an angle, so I can just suggest these shapes. I don't have to paint it exactly like a rock shape in the reflection because it's wet, so I can just lay a shape in and trust that it's going to move down the page a little bit. And then you get this just beautiful suggestion of the reflection as opposed to this solid object that's exactly the same as what's above it in the water. So again, just floating that pigment in there and letting it do its thing. So often with watercolor, we try to force it to do things, and if we are just patient, it will do it for us. It will move on that page, especially when you're working wet into wet. Just lifted that little bit of an extra edge with my brush. Just it went a little too far out. So yellow ochre with just a touch of cobalt blue probably, just suggesting the reflection of that midground field, touching it into that area, really almost floating the paint onto that wet surface, not forcing it. And you'll notice that I keep loading up my brush. I keep getting paint. Often with watercolor, we try to push around the pigment that's already on the page. And we can do that if we're working with acrylic or oil. But when we're doing watercolor, you have to keep getting more pigment. You can't try to push the pigment around that's already on the page because that's how you make mud. That's how you make kind of dirty paint and kind of destroy the surface of the paper. So when in doubt, just get more paint. And there's only so much paint in the brush, so you do have to keep filling it up. Just added a few more darks into those areas using the same colors, ultramarine, cobalt, and brown madder. And now I'm going to lay in some of the shape, the reflection on the right side. And it's not just the reflection of that mid landform, it's also a suggestion of those tree shapes in the back. So it is going to go more to a blue-green at some point. Almost pure yellow ochre dropped in there. And softening that edge up just a bit, trying to figure out what I want that shape to do. I'm not quite sure at this point. Going to mix a little bit of a deeper value and just making a shape, just combining those brush strokes into a shape and trusting that it's going to kind of move down the page. suggesting a little bit of the movement of the water there, and not just the movement, but the reflection of those trees up in the background. And what we want to remember is we're not painting the actual trees, we're painting a reflection in the water and a shape. It's not the exact trees above. We only want to hint at those forms. And now I'm kind of pulling out my flat brush, which I use sometimes when I'm doing a wet and wet, because it combines the shapes so nicely, and I can pop in some of those darker darks and cover areas a little easier without getting the brush marks. And sometimes when I'm doing wet and wet, I'll do a whole painting with a big flat. So just deepening that mid-ground value in the water, and the same with the form on the right side. Mixing a little more perylene green and ultramarine blue, which are the same colors I used in the background for those darkest darks in the trees. And you see how the flat brush allows me to cover large shapes, but also to do some line work. And it keeps me from making too much detail. And remember that less is more. You don't want to say everything about what you're seeing. We're just trying to interpret our emotional response to what we're looking at. So don't be married to your photograph. Let yourself just hint at things. Just say enough that you can let the viewer finish the rest. And using that flat brush just to really darken that whole shape over there, and going right over the line between the reflection and the rock form so that it becomes combined. So it's not, doesn't feel like two separate shapes. Little line work with the flat brush. It's still a little bit damp there, so I'm getting some soft edges. That might have been a little bit too hard. And still painting shapes, thinking about shapes. And that's still the brown matter and ultramarine blue. And kind of just filling in some of that area so it doesn't feel too busy. I don't want it to grab the eye too much. And using that flat brush to just maybe remove a little bit of that paint. It might have gotten a little bit heavy there. And lifting light back into that darker shape. And each time I do this, I lift it, and then I take the pigment out of the brush with a paper towel, because if I do this and then just go back and lift up again, I'm just going to be reapplying the pigment I've just lifted. So yeah, isn't that great how that lifts those little lights out of the water? It gives you a chance to sort of give some directional marks. You can reshape a form that you're not happy with. So this is a time where I sort of think of this as sculpting when I'm lifting back out of the page. And that's what I tell my students, is to just go ahead and paint. Don't worry about it, because we can always lift back into it, especially when we're doing these wet and wet techniques. So it's an interesting painting because the top is kind of a wet and wet, the midground is a wet into dry, and the bottom is a wet into wet. So you can use different techniques in one painting, which is why I really like doing this demo, because it does show you a lot of different ways of painting. And even if you broke this down into 3 separate practice things for yourself, you could just paint the sky area and just play with layering in the pigment that way, and you could just paint the rock area and practice laying in 2 washes, wet into dry, and keeping that light. Using the flat brush again, building up shape, building up more value in here too, because I know that has to be a little bit darker. And these are sort of the final stages of the painting. I'm sculpting a little bit using the flat brush, and then the large flat, and then coming back in with a smaller flat, lifting back in, revealing some light, breaking up an area maybe that has a little too much dark in it and has become uninteresting. And this is where I just paint intuitively. I don't always know what I'm going to get. So it's a little give and take. I try something. If it doesn't work, I try something else. And each time I paint this, it's different. Each time I paint this, there's different colors and different shapes. And things happen, and you just have to be open to trying something you haven't tried before. So using the flat brush to sort of very lightly touch in a few more darks here and there. Give a little bit more value and weight to the reflections in the water. And lifting up a little bit of a vertical line there with my flat brush. And the paper's still wet down there. So I can go back in and do lifting. Need to add a little more pigment to that shape over on the right. There we go. That's yellow ochre and cobalt blue. Fairly saturated pigment, because I know I really have to push back most of the light on that shape. It's a little distracting. That's probably just pure yellow ochre with a little cerulean in it. A little warmer. There we go. That's starting to work. So the darker sort of shadow color in the bottom of the shape and the yellower light in the mid area, and touching a little bit of brown matter in there in the form and then in the water to just hint at there's having something there on that edge, and it brings a little bit of that common brown matter color into that part of the painting, which is always a good idea to have, you know, the similar colors running through your painting. Yeah, that's looking good. And you always want to have red play with green. It really looks nice working together. And it just breaks that shape up a little bit so it doesn't get too monotonous. Deepening that midground a little bit, just because it needs a little more contrast. That's yellow ochre and cobalt blue. And as I deepen that midground, you can see the light shows up on this midground shape on the right. And I'm just going to soften that edge a little, because we don't want, again, we don't want too much attention coming to that shape on the right. We want to have passage in and passage out. A little deeper in there, and a little stronger paint back into that shape, and see how it makes the light hit the shape on the right side. And really just thinking about shape and value. I'm not painting grass, I'm not painting flowers, I'm just painting shapes just to help suggest the light. And I'm actually eliminating some of that light on that midform so that the light that does show really matters. And sometimes our greatest challenge is being able to cover up some of that light, because often there's too much light. Straightening up this line a little bit with a little bit of, again, putting a little bit of the brown matter in there, because that's the common warm that's running through everything. Using the flat brush to sort of break up an area that was becoming a little uninteresting. I kind of like this light now. This is a suggestion of something there on the right. We don't know what it is, but I like the feel of that. And flat brushes are just a wonderful tool for sculpting back into these wet and wet areas. A little more value back there. And remember, everything dries 30% lighter, so that's why I keep putting paint back in there because I'm not getting quite dark enough. So here's the finished product. I thank you so much for joining me today.